Welcome to The Presumption. I'm Sarah Azari, and I'm joined by our wonderful producer, Matt Fondelier today, and my special friend, Pat Harris. Welcome, Pat, to The Presumption.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So, we're missing Jim Griffin, his big loss, because Jim's also in the South like you. But we have a very important conversation today because not only Pat has a lot of great cases to share with us, but specifically the Scott Peterson case that's been in the news lately. For the viewers and the listeners who don't know Pat, he is the creme de la creme of the criminal defense bar, a true Southern gent, as you can tell from his accent, and an LA lawyer. And I've had the pleasure of working with him. We used to share an office together. He's tried over 150 cases to jury, many of them involving high profile defendants. And some of them we're going to be talking about today: Susan McDougal, Michael Jackson, Chris Brown, and of course, Scott Peterson. Pat's also a New York Times bestselling author for his book, The Woman Who Wouldn't Talk, Susan McDougal, who at some point was also your fiance, which I'm going to get to for sure. And then his second book was co-authored with Mark Garagos called Mistrial, which is a behind-the-scenes look at the American justice system. So welcome, Pat, to The Presumption. So Scott Peterson's road to a possible new trial. Everybody's freaking out, saying this guy is a killer. He's going to be out on the streets. And I'm like, just sit down and shut up. At best, he's going to get a new trial. I mean, am I correct to conclude that way?
I think that's the logical outcome here. There would be a small possibility that the court could actually rule that everything that we're asking or saying is right and just dismiss the case. That's a rarity. And really the real possibility is here is a new trial.
Yeah, and this would go on the federal track. It would go to the Ninth Circuit, and then if the relief is granted, then he may be able to get a new trial in the trial court in the county where he was, convicted. It's been almost 20 years. It was November of 2004 when Scott was convicted of murdering Laci, his wife, and their son Connor, and then he was sentenced to death. Later, the death penalty was vacated and he was resentenced to life without parole. This was because the jury, a death penalty jury, has to be really sort of, weeded out for bias against the death penalty. And apparently that had not occurred in this case. So the death penalty went away, which was, one step towards justice for Scott. And now it seems like you've got a judge in San Mateo County who I thought was a male because I work in a man's world, but apparently it's a female, and you called me a sexist. This judge is going to decide what of this tremendous amount of discovery should be turned over to the Los Angeles Innocence Project. And then from there, I guess there's that, I always say discovery opens the door to more discovery. The more you know, you realize there's more that you don't know. And then, this is going to be years of sort of going through and fighting and retesting and independently testing until you get to your relief motion, essentially. So was this, you were trial counsel alongside Mark Garagos. Were these things that you knew existed at the time and they just weren't turned over, or you didn't know and you didn't ask for them? I'm not very clear on this.
It was actually a combination of both. There were things that we did ask for that we were told didn't exist, which we now found out they do exist. That's a big part of it. There are also things that we asked for that we were told, yes, we're turning this over. And now we find out that parts of it were turned over. And there were things that were just hidden that we didn't know existed. Things that we were never told about or never had any access to. And so it's been just a real combination of things. But I can tell you that throughout that trial, it was almost a daily occurrence that we had some sort of discovery dispute with the judge and the prosecutors. The judge ended up screaming at them at one point. And in fact, when there was a witness on the stand that they had failed to turn over discovery on, the judge actually struck her testimony and removed her as a witness because he had had enough of it. But even then, with all the yelling and screaming and our pleading and begging to get this discovery, we still did not receive, we now know we did not receive a huge amount of things that would have been, in some cases, we believe exculpatory, or at the very least would have been things that we would have used at trial.
What would be the reason for the, prosecution to be holding all of this information and just not making people aware of it?
This was a huge, huge, huge trial. I mean, people forget now because it's been 20 years. But at the time, if you put Scott Peterson on television, anything to do with Scott Peterson, the ratings skyrocketed. It was a big, big deal. There was no way in the world the Stanislaus County DA's office or the Modesto Police Department were going to lose this case. We're going to let this happen.
I see.
And they were under huge pressure because it was such a, again, it's hard for even myself looking back to remember just how crazy it was at the time. And that there was this obsession with Scott Peterson. The polls were showing he was the most hated man in America, this fertilizer salesman from Modesto. And it just was, the pressure was on everybody, including, as we'll, I'm sure, talk about shortly, the jurors, to get a conviction. And no matter what it took to get it.
And, I'm always careful about not, accusing prosecutors of, I've had to fight for discovery, and not every withholding is intentional or nefarious. But when you're telling me about this much discovery that you had asked for and were told doesn't exist, it's not one or two things. I read the hundreds of pages that the LA Innocence Project filed because I'm that kind of nerd. But it's a lot of stuff that should have been turned over that wasn't. And then whenever there's like partial disclosure, that always is a red flag to me. It's like, okay, fine, we'll give you this. It's like giving you little breadcrumbs. So, I'm careful about not accusing prosecutors just off the bat that they're nefariously intentionally withholding stuff. But do you think it seems to me like that is the case here?
I've made it very clear. It was intentional.
Yeah.
Every time I've discussed this, it was intentional. There's no doubt in my mind. I've been in the same boat as you, Sarah. I've had prosecutors who, for whatever reason, didn't turn something over. Sometimes it was just an accident. Somebody messed up and didn't put it on the right disc or whatever. Those things happen.
Yeah.
But this was a series of, I'm saying, every single day it was a fight. It was like pulling teeth, and it was a constant. It was clear to us, and both from just dealing with the Stanislaus County DA's office and the Modesto police, especially the Modesto police, but also not only this case, we just got inundated with people sending us things about their cases and what they had to deal with, and how crooked the Modesto Police Department was. And I refer people to the LA Times did a 10-part series on a case involving a lawyer up there named Frank Carson. And Frank Carson had the audacity to run for DA against Birgit Flatiger, and he was rewarded for that effort by being charged with murder. She turned around and actually charged him with murder, put him in jail for a year before the judge released him because there was a lack of evidence. The case went to trial. He was found not guilty. Same sort of things over and over, lack of discovery, the same things we ran into. And I wish I could say that was the only other case, but we've received, I would guess, in excess of 50 to 60 calls, emails from people with a similar experience there.
Yeah, and I've told Jim this too about the Murdaugh case, that the Murdaugh case started about, over, this really corrupt family down in low country, and Murdaugh was corrupt and we got to bring him down. And, and then as things are unfolding in his case, which I feel he was wrongfully convicted, it starting to shed light on much bigger corruption down there within courthouses, within prosecutorial agencies. And so your case, I always love these cases that are so high profile that even after decades, something gives, an avenue to justice opens up, and then, hopefully helps other people. Because I can't imagine how many people have been screwed in Modesto because, they had a public defender, not the public defenders are bad, but just, they don't have the resources, or they had a crappy lawyer, someone that didn't follow through, and, they just got travesties. So
is there can you petition to have somebody disbarred if they just are proven time and time again to just be ignoring these legal precedents? Like, it seems crazy to me. How does this guy still have a job?
It's well, first of all, you have to prove that they've done it, but secondly, yeah, it does happen. I don't think this will shock you, but it's happened several times in Texas. Because there was actually a prosecutor there who, if I'm not incorrect, put somebody on death row and hid the exculpatory evidence, the clear exculpatory evidence. And he was disbarred, and I believe he ended up being charged as well. I think they actually charged him criminally. But it happens rarely. I mean, that's not something very often.
Yeah, and it's interesting. It's like, as I was reading these motions that the LAIP filed, I mean, look, I don't know what's in these or what these test results are going to be or what's in these things that you've asked for, these statements of leads, the tips they had, they didn't follow through. But I mean, if these things start trickling in and they are, it's like doubt after doubt after doubt, then clearly this was intentional withholding. You don't even have to believe Pat Harris, because it's like they handpicked what they don't want to turn over because it would not be good for their case. So I want to get into some specific questions. And please, we're lawyers first on this podcast. And so we understand the parameters of, representing our clients and not talking about specifics of the case that we can't talk about. So if there's something you need to decline to answer, I totally respect that. But these motions came about. I understand there was a reporter who this conviction was not settling to him, came back, never gave up, relentlessly interviewed people and sort of put together what the LAIP is now using. So to the people out there who are under the, wrong impression that this is some frivolous multi-100-page filing that Scott Peterson's coming to court with, I mean, what's your response to that? I mean, what is this? These motions are, there are fruits of years of investigation, right?
That's correct. They're fruits of years and years of investigation. Plus, when the LA Innocence Project jumped on board, they took it to another level. They have taken it to another level. They have, because of their resources and because of their experience, knowing what to do and how to go about doing it. Getting new trials, I would say they have probably taken what we've done and multiplied it by 5 or 10. So it's been sort of us sowing the seeds. And again, that's largely Laci Peterson to a large degree. But myself and my investigator, Jason DeWitt, we went to Modesto. We interviewed some people who had knowledge of what happened that day. And ultimately, we put all this together. We turned it over. They have now, like I said, they've taken it into the stratosphere, and that's how the whole thing came about.
Yeah, and we're recording this interview on Tuesday, March 12th, the day that Scott Peterson is appearing in court on these motions for discovery towards a ruling as to what of it will be disclosed. And you're not there because this is the LAIP's case, but the LAIP is getting a lot of heat. I'm hearing people say, and I volunteered for the Loyola Innocence Project. A good friend of mine, Justin Brooks, who was on this podcast as well, ran I think it was called the California Innocence Project in San Diego. I'm very familiar with the organization. My friend Mike Cavaluzzi just did a trial with Paula Mitchell not too long ago. So the bottom line is people are after the LAIP because, oh my God, they're not even a real Innocence Project. There's some made up concocted thing and I'm like, first of all, the Innocence Project gets funded by, private funding, public funding, grants, etc. And a lot of volunteers, trial lawyers, law students, etc. And they typically follow just sort of a standard guideline of how they vet cases and what they do and how they raise their funds. But there's no headquarters. Someone came after me saying, I don't understand because they're not part of the headquarters. I'm like, there is no headquarter for the Innocence Project. So it just goes to show you when the media is so, the spotlight is on a particular defendant or case, it's just, it's always leaning towards guilt. The guy should be locked up forever. Everything went correctly, he shouldn't get out. So anyway, I just wanted to address that with the Innocence Project because that is just bullshit.
And our people are just upset with them because it's Scott Peterson. Because I mean, they've obviously handled thousands of other cases that no one has any problem with, but now they're the enemy.
It's funny you say that, Matt, because Paula and the Innocence Project and some of the others working on it, I don't think any of them understood what I always refer to as the Scott Peterson effect. And when they did take it, I think they were all stunned because the death threats started coming. They started getting things from emails, people saying, I'm never going to contribute to you again. I'll fight against you from now on. I mean, even lawyers, they were really sort of stunned by just the anger still.
Yeah.
So
and, I have a good friend who's very liberal, very sort of pro, criminal justice reform and all that. And she called me up and she goes, what do you think about this? I give a lot of money to the Innocence Project. I just want to make sure, like, this is legit. Is this legit? I'm like, of course it's legit. It's like 700 plus pages worth of legitimacy. Okay, just sit down, Anyway, people are just, it's one of those really hot cases still after all these years. So going to some of the specifics, there was evidence that a burglary had occurred across the street from the Peterson home where Scott and Laci lived, at the same time that Laci, I guess, had disappeared, or around that same time. Can you tell us what that evidence is and whether or not it was presented during the trial?
Well, what happened is we had bits and pieces. Everyone knew that what had happened was that there was a burglary at the house directly across the street from Laci and Scott. The Modesto police found the supposed two guys that were involved. And they arrested him. And based on what we were given, the discovery we were given, we were told, and it was explained to us that the robbery occurred on December 26th, which is 2 days after Laci disappeared. We were told that one of the people passed a lie detector test. We were told that, in essence, they had investigated the robbery further, investigated other leads, and they led nowhere. All this we were told at the time, and we were given very little information. We presented, to me, it was an immediate reaction that if there's a burglary at the same time across the street, and keep in mind, there was testimony from Laci's mother and others, that Laci was a little bit of a firecracker, that she would confront people in the streets. If she saw somebody, a homeless person, digging through trash, she would confront them. That was the testimony. So it struck me immediately that if there was a robbery there across the street, we could show that it was the 24th and not the 26th, that we would be, we would go a long way into proving Scott's innocence. Unfortunately, we didn't have enough information. And as you know, Sarah, in California, I think it's the strictest law in the country in terms of blaming someone else for a murder. You have to show, before you can ever point the finger at anyone else, you have to show quite a bit of evidence to the judge who makes a ruling and says, okay, yes, you can proceed with that defense against that person or no. In this case, we didn't have much evidence at that time, although we were digging and trying, but we just didn't have it. And the judge really didn't let us tell the jury that there was a burglary. And then, of course, they got up and said it was the 26th. But that was about it.
So it was a combination of evidentiary ruling that wasn't great for you and this, misinformation, frankly, from the prosecution.
Absolutely. And the DA still, in fact, in an interview not too long ago, apparently they said, well, that issue, the burglary issue, was decided by the jury already. Burglary issue was never decided.
Right. And that is the issue. That is the doubt here,
Absolute. I cannot stress enough that here you have a husband. Of course, we know he was having an affair, but by all accounts, with everyone, they had a great marriage. They did well together. He loved her a lot. They were witnesses who talked about how excited he was about the baby and doing classes and how, buying clothes and just really thrilled with the way, with the pregnancy, versus that's the guy who kills her, versus burglars across the street breaking into a house at the exact same time she disappears. And clearly our obvious conclusion is she confronted him or interrupted him in some way. So you take the choice between those two, which is the most likely?
Sometimes it's not even interrupting. Sometimes it's just the fact that someone just saw you, would prompt someone who's committing a crime in the middle of a crime to want to get rid of that person. That's an eyewitness.
And again, I can't get too far into the details, but we have witnesses that she specifically confronted them.
Okay.
So
part of our.
One of the kind of news headlines that I've seen is related to this van that was discovered. Is that sort of part of the same, narrative strand as the robbery? Is the implication that the robbers used this van and tried to torch the van? Or is that something separate?
We know two things. We know that there's a witness who reported the next day that she had seen a van in the driveway and described the van. And then we also have the burglars themselves who admitted that when they broke into the house, the one who first broke in was on a bicycle. There was a huge safe, which he and another guy pulled out into the front yard. And they couldn't take it on a bicycle. So they called some friends and a van came over and picked it up. So we have both van sightings and the fact that this is what was basically told. So yes, there is some background on that. One of the things you asked Sarah,
this is part of the trial, right? The stuff that you're just saying, what you're saying about the van and the driveway and then calling the van to come pick up the safe, this all came out in the trial, right?
No. We weren't allowed to get into this. We were not allowed again because the judge ruled that there was not sufficient evidence to point our fingers at this.
There are two vans at issue, basically.
There are two potential vans at issue. That's correct.
And there's one van that I guess was it was an orange van that was found burnt on Christmas morning that may have had blood samples in it. At the time of the trial, were they collected and tested, or are those things that you're hoping would be tested as a result of these motions?
The way it worked was the van was found the day after on Christmas Day. And we were, one of the fire chiefs went down, was told that there's a burning van down there, went down and looked at it, found a mattress in the back with bloodstains, especially a big area of bloodstains, like one huge circle of bloodstains, which was covered up by, I think it was a gas can, had been put on top of the bloodstains. He reported it to Modesto police. They took the van in, and when you ask about discovery issues, for example, we were provided the pictures of the van and the mattress in black and white, and we requested color. And we never got them. Well, black and white, you don't see the blood.
Right.
It's just an oil stain.
It's an oil stain. Yeah, you can't even tell. I mean, the black and white pictures, you can't even see this. Oh, my God. So then we found out later down the road that, in fact, there had been some DNA testing done, but and I can't get too far into this, but ultimately it was not done correctly. And that's what the LA Innocence Project is dealing with now.
But so two questions about the DNA first. Obviously, there's been so many advancements in that technology that I assume that's one of the reasons why you're seeking to retest some of the things, even if, maybe they weren't improperly tested at the time. But can you tell us if Laci's DNA was found in the van?
We don't know.
Oh.
We don't know. I will say this, and I think this is important. What the LA Innocence Project is doing is a myriad of things, a lot of things. And the DNA testing of that mattress is just one thing. And I know they've already been criticized and said, well, okay, if, that's going to come back as a big nothing, and that'll show you that this whole thing's a wild goose chase.
Yeah.
It very well may. But the point is, this is just one example of things that we should have been notified during the trial. We should have known what was going on, and we weren't. It was kept from us. So that's the real issue here. And this is just one thing out of, as you said, there's 70 pages of it. So yes, that's the real issue here.
So the orange van has always been a mystery to me. that it was in a warehouse. I remember that it was towed to a warehouse. Is that orange van from the driveway or the one that drove up to take the safe?
We're not sure. We actually don't know yet.
Okay, but you guys, both parties went to this warehouse and were able to inspect the orange van and whatever was on it. Is that not true?
We weren't, no.
You never got to go see the van. You were only given black and white pictures of the van?
We weren't even aware they were storing it. We knew that there had been a burnt van. We got pictures of it. It just showed a burnt van. And ultimately, they took pictures of the inside. All we see is a mattress that has no blood on it or whatsoever.
In black and white.
Essentially, we were actually told a couple of things that indicated it was not related to Laci. And we weren't even aware that the van had anything other than some parts of the mattress had been cut out. That was the only thing we were aware of.
So no inspection of the van, no independent testing of the van, and all you got is black and white pictures of the mattress.
Yes, which there was no suspicion of that.
And you don't know
which
van is orange because you got black and white photos, right?
That's part of it. I mean, it was burnt out as well.
Right.
But I think one of the bigger parts that's frustrating here is that we would have done more research. And as you mentioned, there was a reporter who stuck with this, and he has done more research. And one of the things that at this point I can't get into, but will come out, is the research he's done. And he has traced the origin of the van. And the origin of the van goes to people we suspected were involved in it.
Wow. That's huge. And the other thing I read was that the material found near Laci's body is another thing that the LAIP wants to test. Is that even something? I've never had a case like this, so I don't know. Wouldn't, after being in water for so long, is that even something that can be tested?
I don't know, to be honest with you. I don't know the answer to that question. My gut reaction is no, that it's still there. It would still stay, but I don't know that to be true. I to be honest, I've never had a situation either.
And then you were mentioning this phone call where an inmate tells his brother on a jail call to shut up about Laci being kidnapped that day. What's that about?
Well, we were in the last week of trial. I mean, we were literally in the last week. We were getting ready to do the last witnesses in our closing when we receive information that there is a phone call, a recorded phone call from a prison, Norco, down in Southern California, and that essentially the shift supervisor was one of the sergeants came. As you know, they listened to all the phone calls that inmates make. He comes to the supervisor and says, you really need to hear this because this is about Laci Peterson. So he listens, and in his declaration, the supervisor, he says that it's two brothers, one of whom is incarcerated, the other who's out. And one of the brothers starts talking about Laci Peterson, and the other says, shut up. We can't talk about that. This is being recorded. Shut up about it, blah, blah, blah. And that he felt was obviously important. He says in his original declaration that he got that tape and gave it to Modesto police. Modesto police denies it, that they ever got the tape. They then turned around, they interviewed him, and he denies that he ever gave them the tape himself. He says, well, maybe I didn't give him the tape. So he changes his story. Now, we have him under sworn declaration that he gave it to him, signed under penalty of perjury. Okay. But he changed his story, came back and said, well, maybe I didn't give it to him. Mm-hmm. Obviously, he's sticking with law enforcement. But we know that exists. We know, we believe, we think we might even know where that tape is now. That's a long shot, but we at least have a lead as to where that tape may be.
But they could potentially play this tape, and it would just be like the ultimate bombshell, like to just hear something like that.
You would think so, yes.
Wow.
Yeah.
You thought this was crazy 20 years ago. I got news for you, my friend. If this thing comes back and then goes that way, this is gonna just like blow up the entire world. That's insane.
Yeah. That's what we're hoping.
Something that I just love how people just kind of gloss over as just a salacious nothing burger is the claim of a romantic affair between the DA and the lead detective that they failed to disclose to the defense. That is huge. And in fact, recently in another state, a conviction was overturned because of that very reason. And so, first of all, why don't we hear it from you? Why is that a problem in this case? And do you think it's just a fact that you threw in there that might dilute all the other substantive stuff you're arguing, or is it a real issue?
Well, if it's true, it's a real issue. It's a very important issue. And the circumstances are that one of the district attorneys, a woman named Birgit Flatiger, she was not the head district attorney at that time. She was an assistant district attorney. She came every day to trial and she would sit in the audience. She didn't sit at counsel table, but she would sit in the audience. Then all of a sudden, when the detective, the lead detective, he was the last witness, she got up and she did the direct testimony of the witness. And there was this simpatico. They were heavily praised for their ability to communicate and what a great job he did and what a great job she did, presenting it all. And that's great. You pat them on the back and say congratulations, except that we've now learned that there is a distinct possibility, and we actually learned it from an inside source, that they were having this affair at the time. We know that they ended up together after the trial. That's not in dispute. Mm-hmm. But there is now evidence that they may have been cavorting during the trial. Why is that important? Because a police officer technically is supposed to be a neutral witness. Now, we all know law enforcement testifies for the mm-hmm. prosecution, usually. But they are supposed to be neutral. They're supposed to investigate, present mm-hmm. their facts. Mm-hmm. If they're sleeping with somebody whose career literally hangs on this, then mm-hmm. how do you know you're getting honest testimony? You don't. In fact, you assume the opposite, that you're not getting honest testimony because they are definitely biased and trying to help the person they're essentially sleeping with.
Right. And this is not analogous to like Fani Willis in Georgia with her colleague, the special prosecutor. And that issue is completely different. This is exactly like what Pat is saying. It's that you've got this sort of neutral, unbiased person that's supposed to just present evidence, gather evidence, not for either side, helpful, hurtful, whatever it is. And then you've got someone who's looking for a guilty verdict. And so anyway, that was mind boggling. And I think that, if you have a good claim, if it's corroborated by an inside source. You mentioned some Amber tapes. Those are not Amber Alert things. Those are a person referring to a person. Is it Amber Fry?
Amber Fry. That was.
Yes. Who is that?
Amber Fry was a woman that Scott had. I don't call it an affair because I think he saw her a total of 4 times. They had basically a sexual relationship that began.
I think that's called booty call these days. Booty.
Yeah, that's probably more accurate reflection of this.
One night stand, booty call.
Let the record show it was a booty call.
Side chick is a new term. Side chick. Yeah. Okay, go ahead.
Well, originally the prosecution in the trial tried to say this was a motive, that Scott was going to kill Laci so he could be with Amber. That became stupid. It was just ridiculous. He had no love interest in Amber. He just was interested in sex. And she lived in Fresno, a few hours down the road, and was not aware he was married. So ultimately what happened here is Amber sort of figures out what's going on, who Scott Peterson is after Laci disappears. It took several weeks. But she sort of figures it out. She actually didn't own a television. She may be the only human being on the planet who doesn't own a television. So she didn't see it all. She finds out, however, about Scott. She goes to law enforcement, and they start taping the phone conversation between her and Scott. And truthfully, if you look back at the trial, the first 2 or 3 months of testimony, it was a wipeout. The defense destroyed it. We destroyed them. To the point where the local newspaper said that the prosecution may need to look at dismissing this case. Every single witness got destroyed. Then Amber took the stand, and it was not her testimony that hurt, it was the tapes. And the reason the tapes were so just devastating is Scott is on there lying to her about Laci, and he's lying about where he is. They make a lot of fun of it.
Scott, why?
I'm sorry?
She taped Scott, why?
Because she went to law enforcement and told them, and they asked her to tape him.
Got it.
So she was doing it under there, and they were feeding her the questions. But he was telling her all kinds of crazy stories about being in Paris and things like that. And the reason he was doing it was because he didn't want her coming to Modesto. He kept telling her he was out of town. He kept creating stories about being in Europe and places so she wouldn't come to Modesto looking for him. And because at this point, he didn't know she knew. So ultimately, he's giggling with her. He's laughing on the phone. They're I won't say they're being romantic because I wouldn't call it romantic, but there's, cute little asides back and forth. And when you play that to a jury, when a woman's missing, and, now we know she was dead, and you play that to them and you hear the husband giggling and laughing with another woman, it was devastating. And you could watch. I mean, it was almost palpable watching the shift, not only in the media, the courtroom, but certainly the jury. And there's just the intense hatred began for him. And it's because of the tapes.
And okay, well, I guess this woman, I mean, was she rejected, or was it she wanted more than a booty call and she didn't get it? I mean, what was her story to flip on him like that?
I think she just scared. I think she was scared. Oh. She found herself in this hurricane, and the police just basically said, "You can help us." And Scott Peterson's a murderer and murdered his wife, and you need to help us. So I'm sure they probably, this, Sarah, they probably threw a little bit of a sort of a threat in there that if you don't help us, you could be considered part of this.
Correct. You can be an accomplice or aider and abettor, whatever, like accomplice after the fact or something.
Sure.
So compound question, you attribute the conviction also to the jury's, aside from the Amber tapes, disregard for computer evidence that was before them that showed Laci at the computer the morning before she went missing. Number one, what was that evidence, and why do you think it would have made a difference potentially? And number two, you've also mentioned that there were juror issues. What were the juror issues? Well,
first with the computer, this was amazing because they had a computer expert that they hired, the prosecution. We had a computer expert we hired and paid a ridiculous amount of money. Neither one of them found anything that was on the computer that was worthwhile. Mark, the prosecution's expert, got up. Mark has an ability to do some very bizarre, great cross-examinations. And somehow or another, he saw something. He's not a computer expert. He saw something, and it clicked, and he got the prosecution computer expert to go back in and look in. And by the time it was over, the prosecution expert said, yes, it looks like somebody was on Laci's computer that morning. Somebody was looking at sunflower umbrella stands specifically, and Laci loved sunflowers. She had a sunflower tattoo. They were looking at women's sweaters, and I forgot the third thing, but it was pretty clear it was things that were probably Laci. We thought this is great because the prosecution at this point is arguing that Laci was killed the night before, that he'd killed her on the 24th, on Christmas Eve. So we thought this was great. We presented to the jury. We mentioned it in closing 2, 3, 4 times. Keep going back to it. This proves that they don't know the case, that she wasn't murdered. And that later that night, after the verdict, the jurors were interviewed on Larry King, and there were like 6 or 7 of them there in a panel. And Larry King asked them straight out, said, "Why did you not believe the computer evidence was important?" And I'm telling you, if you ever see the clip, it's on YouTube. A bunch of blank faces. I mean, it's like they had no clue. They didn't think about it. At that point, they'd shut down. I mean, we mentioned it at least 3 times in the closing. They weren't listening. They didn't care.
I think, when jurors, when something clicks and it's just one piece of evidence in the face of a lot of, reasonable doubt, nothing else matters, like the Amber tapes were probably they were so disgusted with that that they didn't care, yeah. Right. And so it just, and what were the juror issues?
Well, I talk about juror issues because they tried to come out and act like that they really didn't feel any pressure and they were just doing the right thing. And it just wasn't true. And for example, I use one of my favorite examples is one of the jurors came out was being interviewed in the big area outside the courthouse, and he's being interviewed, and he says, what really what bugged me, and one of the reasons we convicted Scott was because he'd come out of that, the back there, and he'd come up to the table and he'd be smiling and strutting, and he'd be waving at his family or just kind of just laughing like it was all a big circus and just a good time. And we proved to you, Scotty boy, it wasn't a good time. You're going to spend your time in San Quentin now. Mm-hmm. Well, Sarah, there's a problem with that. Number one, a defendant is never brought out with the jury present.
Right.
The jury was never present in that courtroom when Scott Peterson was brought out. When they came in the courtroom, he's sitting next to me. Okay. So that was just a bullshit made up story.
True. Yeah.
Absolutely. But it shows you the anger, and he was proud of himself. Yeah, we got you, Scotty boy. That you're not laughing anymore. Well, Scott was never laughing. That was just absolutely. But it's that it shows you, and the jury issue we had with the one who essentially, we believe, got on the jury where she admits that she was there to fry him. And I mean, there were just all kinds of jury issues that we had. And most importantly, the jurors. There were two of them that were willing to find Scott innocent were both kicked off the jury. One of them midway through the trial, and he came out on Larry King. He was interviewed, and he said, no, there's no evidence. I don't know why they're going after this guy. And then later in jury deliberations, the foreperson, who was a doctor and a lawyer, both, he was the foreperson. He was leading it, and apparently he was leading it in a direction where he was being very thorough about the evidence, and the other jurors didn't like it. And one of them threatened him physically, literally threatened to hurt him. And that juror came to the judge and said, I want off. I want off. And instead of the judge kicking the person who threatened off, which is what should have happened, he let the foreperson go.
So,
I just wanted to ask, because it's kind of related to a question that I had, which was about this idea of jurors being improperly dismissed. So that's sort of what you were alluding to before, that as important as it is to have people on the jury, that can have an open mind about this case, there are sometimes issues where it's not even about who was on the jury. It's about somebody who didn't get to vote.
That's right. That's exactly right.
And that there's this still chatter about his blonde hair. You mentioned miscellaneous circumstantial evidence that, you felt like you had properly explained or sufficiently explained. And nonetheless, like the dyed blonde hair to this day, people argue that it was, he was trying to escape. He was trying to go under the radar, so he's not detected. Just briefly, what's up with the blonde hair?
I'll throw you two things. The blonde hair thing was so silly because they said, well, he was trying to escape and he was going to run to Mexico, so he dyed his hair blonde so they couldn't find him. Well, we actually showed a picture, was put into evidence, of Scott in his truck speaking to the detective, the main detective, with blonde hair after his hair had dyed his hair. And it's kind of a funny story because he got some cheap one. He was trying to avoid the media. He wasn't trying to avoid the police. He was trying to avoid the media. He got a cheap hair thing. It was supposed to turn his hair kind of a red, but then he went to a friend's house and he got in the pool and the chlorine turned it blonde. So it came out this funny color. But we have a picture of him sitting with the police with that hair. And who in the world would disguise themselves from the police and then go meet with the police? I mean, it was just stupid. There was so many stupid things about escaping to Mexico. He was actually driving north. He wasn't driving south. He was driving north.
Wrong direction. This was Southern California.
Like that.
So also, Modesto residents have said that they saw Laci walking her dog after Scott went fishing. So she was around. And many of them say the police never followed up with them. Are these some of those allegations and the motions that, about leads that weren't followed through with? Or, okay.
Absolutely. There's a lot of that. There are some new ones that were not present at
so this new evidence, I don't need to know all the details, but the new evidence, is it accurate that it consists of witnesses and forensics, or is it witnesses and a request to get the forensics?
It's a combination of both. It's witnesses, forensics, and a request to get some additional forensics.
Okay, so you also do have forensics.
Yes.
Okay. I'm almost done with this before we move on. I promise. It's a big case. So we obviously don't know how Laci died and where she died and when. In these motions, the LAIP is claiming that these leads were not followed. Are any of these, forget about reasonable doubt, but are any of these just abandoned, ignored leads ones that could not only say could have been the burglars, but could it in fact identify specific suspects and what happened to her and how she died?
To a degree. We have put together what we believe is a fairly accurate rendition of what happened and who was involved. We have a group of people involved. In fact, we know that the burglary was more than two people. We now know that it was a number of people. The way that they worked in Modesto is they worked in groups. And for example, if somebody found a house that was empty, they would call others and say, come on over, and they'd sit there and watch TV, drink their beer, and steal their stuff. So, 4 or 5 guys come over. So we have identified a group. So the witnesses, some of the new witnesses, help with that. But I can't say that they specifically say, oh, this person, this person, this person. It's not like that.
And it's not the job of a defendant to do that. I mean, obviously the burden is a lot higher when you're trying to exonerate yourself. But it's on you and it's not on the prosecution. But at the trial level, it's funny to me when people say, well, if he didn't do it, then who did it? Why didn't he go investigate it and find out who did it? I'm like, it's not my damn job to do that, So it's their burden to prove that my client is guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. So anyway, this was a great conversation, and I hope that when you are able to share more, that you definitely come back and talk to us.
Sure.
Another very interesting case that you had, and I was telling Matt about it, and he was just like bewildered, is the priest case. I'm going to turn it over to Matt.
Yeah, this is just like a wild story of, in my opinion, vigilante justice is what it should be. This guy is a hero. He's Batman as far as I'm concerned. But as the story unfolds, you represented a man named Will Lynch who beat up a priest who, trigger warning for our listeners, I don't know if he actually molested him and his brother, but kind of made them perform sexual acts on each other. Super traumatizing. Of course, Will tried to get this handled through the authorities, but no help from different DA offices. And so finally he finds out that this guy, the priest, has been moved to like a retirement home, and he gets inside and beats the shit out of this guy to the point where he thinks that maybe he killed him. Yeah. Not that that's like a right thing to do, but like, I feel like there's so many movies about this. Like, what is one man supposed to do when he's been wronged so tragically?
Also, the retirement home was not really a retirement home. It was for dirty priests, right? Abusers.
The majority of the priests there, not all, but the majority of the priests there had been moved there for the very reason that they had been either accused or found guilty of having molested or whatever.
So what happened when you stepped in?
That's exactly what I was going to ask.
It was, as you said, I mean, you laid it out very nicely. He and his brother were 5 and 7 years old, I believe, or 6 and 7. And they went on a Catholic retreat with their parents, and the priest got them aside in a tent and molested them and then made them perform acts on each other, which was obviously extraordinarily traumatizing. Will grows up. As he gets into his late 30s and early 40s, he starts going to district attorneys and police departments, and they're telling him, statute of limitations, forget about it, go on. And so he's very frustrated. Ultimately, he finds out this priest is at this location, and you just mentioned it, Sarah. It's a place where they put a lot of the bad apples.
Right.
And he goes down there. He lies, tells him the priest is somebody he knows, and he needs to tell him something. Gets in to see the priest, and then starts walloping him, and wallops him pretty good. And to the point, like I said, he thought he killed him. So then he leaves. He goes home. About a month later, the police show up at his door, and he's got a roommate, and they say, we want to talk to him. And so Will goes back while his roommate's talking to the police, goes back and calls our office. I don't know why he called our office to this day. I'm not even sure. He doesn't even know. But he talked to the receptionist. The receptionist filters things and sends cases to other people. But she called me, said, you need to pick up this case. You need to. And I said, why? She said, just pick up the phone. So I picked up the phone, and Will's on the line. He said, the police are here. And I said, okay, what did you do? He said, I think I killed a priest. I said, okay, I'll be right there. He was in Northern California. I was in Southern California. I got on a plane that night. I said, you stay, you tell him, get a card, and tell the roommate that he's got a lawyer, and his lawyer will bring him in. So we went, brought him in. He was arrested, released. And then they charged him with 4 counts, 2 of assault with a deadly weapon, his fists, and 2 of elder abuse, because the priest was over 70. And we went to trial. And before trial, Will told me they offered a pretty good deal. But Will said no. He said, I want to tell my story. I want people to understand what happened and why this happened. And I want to be able to protect other people. So I said, well, you clearly did it. He said, I'm going to get on the stand and admit it. I said, well, the only chance you have then is jury nullification. That's the only defense you have. And we're not allowed to bring that up in court. We can hint around it. We can kind of hopefully push the jury, but we can't say it. We can't utter those words.
Meaning that you can't tell the jurors that they have to nullify this case. They have to kind of reach that conclusion themselves.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly right. So we go to trial. Will gets on the stand. He said, looks at the jury and said, yeah, I did it. And what was crazy about the thing, before trial, the judge had told us he was not going to let us get into the molestation. He said, I will let you say one sentence that you were molested when you were a child by a priest. He said, that's it. I'm not going to let you anything else. Mm-hmm. For some bizarre reason, which I will never understand, the prosecution chose in their opening statement to put on a television interview that Will had done. He had done it the week before. We frankly did it because we were trying to get it out there. Mm-hmm. And Will's on this television interview. And I guess the reason they put it on is because Will's admitting he did it. But we were going to do that at trial anyway. But he's also crying and he's talking to molestation. They played a good 2 to 3 minutes of that in their opening statements. And at that point, as soon as it stopped, I said, excuse me, I want to go back in chambers. And I looked at the judge and said, they've opened the door to this. And the judge looks at the prosecutor and said, you sure did. I said, Mr. Harris, you can talk about it all you want.
Wow. It
was just crazy. So the priest got on the stand. This was another crazy story. He gets on the stand. He testifies to what happens. At 4:25, court goes till 4:30. 4:25, they ask him the question. The prosecutor asked him, did you molest Will Lynch? He says no. We recess for the day. The next day we come back. I mean, I'm chomping at the bit. I can't wait. I mean, you can imagine, Sarah, getting to cross-examine this guy. So he comes and he's got a lawyer. And the lawyer tells the judge he's taking the 5th. And the judge said, well, you've already testified. And he said, well, I'm not testifying anymore. I'm taking the 5th. So the judge then struck all his testimony. But at that point, they'd heard it. The jury had heard it. So that wasn't a great solution for me. I asked for the case to be dismissed. But anyway, we go forward with the trial. Things seem to go well. The jury goes in deliberations. 1 hour later, the jury sends out a note that says, what is jury nullification and can we do it? The judge sent this terrible. I mean, we fought like crazy for an hour. I mean, I'm researching everything I can, and I've got 4 different people researching to get the right answer. The judge sent back this terrible answer that essentially threatened them, saying, you have to do your duty as it's by law, and you could even be prosecuted. I mean, he doesn't say prosecuted, but you could even be held in contempt or something if you don't do your job. So I'm thinking, okay, we're screwed now. An hour later, they came back with not guilties. And we were so floored that I got a hold of the juror, the juror foreman. I said, how in the world did jury nullification? You use that phrase. How did you know to use that phrase? And he said one of the jurors saw it on an episode of Law and Order.
Law and Order has just done a lot of interesting things for us, It's funny because it's not even like how things really work. But my sister to this day, she's not a lawyer, but she says every time I go to trial, she says, you could try it out on me. You could do your opening statement, your closing argument, because I just have watched every episode of Law and Order, so I really understand trials. I'm like, yeah, right. You'll be the last person I'd be doing it with. But anyway,
I have one final thing about that that's just pretty amazing. One of the local radio stations was covering it. They nicknamed the place where the priests were, the Rapist Resort.
What?
Caught up. They nicknamed it the Rapist. They would call it the Rapist Resort, and that caught on.
Where you go for R&R.
It's pretty crazy. I mean, there were actually lawsuits against that place because there were some incidents there where the priests were raping the help there. So anyway,
interesting. So I want to close with, obviously, I know how big a highlight it was to represent Michael Jackson. But you also represented Chris Brown, several other high-profile individuals, and Susan McDougal. There is a question I have to ask you about Chris Brown, because I think this is also a case that you and Mark Garagos had together. And I remember I was in the office when Chris would come in for his probation, check-ins or whatnot after the fact. But there's been a lot of criticism. Well, he just pled to the sheet. And I, tell people, do you understand what a DV charge is all about? Because it's a battery, like any other battery, except between domestic partners. And your best defense is self-defense. And, where there's injuries and you've got a female victim, I mean, it's very difficult to change the sheet. So the focus then becomes on, the terms, whether you can get jail time or not, the term of probation, all that stuff. So did Chris Brown have any defense to go to trial?
No, he didn't. And to his credit, I found one of the interesting things about him is he was nothing like the press portrayed him as. He was actually, he walked in the very first day and said, I need to take responsibility for this. I was out of my mind. He said she did get violent with me, but I responded wrong. I mean, he was very, very straightforward.
Right.
But he was just an interesting character. And I tell people, we're all a mixture of good, bad. Sometimes we go off the rails. Sometimes we do things we shouldn't. But we're all a mixture of good and bad. And he was being vilified. At the same time he was being vilified, I had a 14-year-old boy in my office when Chris Brown came in one day. And the 14-year-old boy, I was trying to get out of trouble, and who was troubled, a lot of issues. And he was just wide-eyed when he saw Chris Brown. He said, "Oh my God, he's my hero. I love him, blah, blah, blah." And so I went to Chris Brown and I said, "Would you just say hello? Just shake his hand. Go say hello to the kid." Chris Brown got up, went, sat on a couch with him, and sat there with him for 15 minutes and talked to him. And it really was one of the, my God, it made the kid's life. And it was just one of those things where you realize that your client can be vilified. And yes, they do sometimes do horrible things or bad things, but we all have our good sides, and we all have good things about us. And sometimes we just do something stupid. Sometimes not.
Yeah. Domestic violence, it's not, it's really not always about the person being a violent person. It's a toxic relationship that really leads to an aberrant incident of violence. I mean, that's been my experience. Is like, most of my DV clients are not, people that go around beating people up or their girlfriends or their wives up. It's just that they, for whatever reason, like you said, we all have our bad, broken sides, and that broken part of them ends them up in a very toxic relationship they should not be in. And then you add alcohol and drugs to that. Right. It is a nightmare. And that is like, instead of leaving, you beat the person up. Not saying it's okay, but but that's sort of the usual thing. So let's close with Susan McDougal, because I'm like, you were violating your ethical duties, having sex with a client. Like, how are you doing that?
Well, let's be clear. Susan and I dated, or were together, I guess you'd say, for almost 16 years.
Well, explain for our listeners, who is Susan McDougal?
Susan McDougal was the Whitewater partner of Bill Clinton and Hillary Clinton. She and her husband at the time, Jim McDougal, the four of them were the Whitewater partners. And when everything started getting investigated in Whitewater, they desperately wanted Susan to testify against the Clintons. They were determined to get her because Jim McDougal had gone sort of psycho, and he couldn't be a witness, even though he was cooperating. Clearly, the Clintons weren't going to cooperate, so they thought they could get Susan, and they tried to pressure her into doing it, and she refused. And to the point where they put her in front of a grand jury, and she refused, and she ended up doing 22 months in different prisons and jails across the country for refusal to testify. So that's who Susan McDougal is. We were together, and for a long, long time before I went to law school. And then I went to law school. We got out, we got engaged, we had these plans, and then all hell broke loose with Whitewater, Clinton getting elected in 92, and then starting in 93, 94, they went after Susan. So I get to at least claim I was sleeping with her before I became a lawyer.
Okay, then I'm good with that. I'm good with that. Good thing you clarified it. Okay. So, and you wrote the book on
I wrote the book called The Woman Who Wouldn't Talk, which did really well. Susan was a fascinating character. She is a fascinating character to the point where now this is a woman who's been through all kinds of craziness. She is now a chaplain at the largest medical center in Little Rock, Arkansas. She's the head chaplain there. I mean, her story since all this is pretty incredible. So, unique individual.
Yeah, that's amazing. Go ahead, Matt. You were going to say something?
No, I just was going to kind of try to bring it home here and just say thank you so much for coming on the show. You've amazing stories and perspective, and just really fascinating to hear everything. So thank you so much.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, my friend. And I hope that, when you can talk more about Peterson, that we can continue the conversation. Because in the meantime, I'll be texting you and calling you and bothering you anyway. But we could have
you can bother me anytime, Sarah.
On the record conversation. And until next time, well, first of all, please follow us. Follow us on YouTube at The Presumption, and then also on wherever you get your podcasts, Apple, Spotify, all of it. Download, follow us, and don't miss an episode. And until next time, we rest.